All right, here we are with the latest edition of the Grim Wisdom Podcast. I guess I probably have more than 10 voters, so wow, or 10 listeners rather. So wow, I passed a milestone because my YouTube page has 50 views on my last podcast. With me today again is Mike Arujo. I think I'm really excited about having him. I always enjoy spending time with Mike. He's just so... he's, I don't always agree with you on everything, but you're very wise and insightful. I think I learned a lot from you. At the risk of, being too... I don't want this to be too upbeat because this is the Grim Wisdom Podcast, so the idea, as always, is, you should be... At the end of this, you should feel enlightened and depressed. So if we don't meet that bar, we haven't done what we set out to do. But that being said, I think we can start on a positive note. I really appreciate having Mike Arujo on. I always enjoy talking to him about this, and just before we got started here, I gave him a list of the topics, and he's like, it's fine, man, we'll just talk about whatever, and I can just talk about a subject I know nothing about. And I said, oh, we have that in common.
Yeah, we're good with that.
We're good with that. So one thing, so there's a lot been going on in the last couple of weeks. One thing I didn't get a chance to talk about in last week's podcast, but I think is really apropos, is the Black Lives Matter came out with their actual platform for change, and it is sort of jaw-droppingly amazing. It's really, from what I can tell, it's a pretty comprehensive list of things that need to get done, and that will never get done because it will never be, the owners of this country will never allow it. But it was a really good list of if all of these things were implemented, America would be a pretty cool place to live. And so none of them will ever get implemented, right? But I thought we could talk a little about that platform. I thought that was... you mentioned that. I thought that's a really good subject to discuss. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll also talk about, Mike wanted just before the podcast, he mentioned something called the velocity of change, which I thought was a really interesting conversation to have, because I feel a lot of urgency. I think there's one thing to say of certain kinds of changes should be revolutionary and transformative. Certain kind of changes must be incremental. You have this constant tension, and I think there are certain kinds of problems for which, when the building is on fire, you don't have time to negotiate the firefighter salaries right then and there, right? Either the building burns down or you put out the fire. One of those two things is going to happen, right? So, not that it's bad to negotiate firefighter salaries, but I'm all for a collective bargain.
Yeah, very good. Good answer.
Yeah. Maybe not the best possible analogy, but I think you all see what I'm getting at, or hear what I'm getting at. And then also, too, I think... we'll talk about the broader labor movement, whether it even really makes sense anymore to talk about such a thing as a labor movement when it's so fractious and there's so many different divisions, especially with some of the news we've heard about in the last few weeks. There's apparently the National Guard's being called out in Milwaukee, martial law, etc. So we'll talk about that as well. And what else was I going to mention? We might talk about sacrifice, but we'll see if we get to it. We'll see. I think we've got a lot of meat on our plate to eat. So
this is plenty.
Yeah.
Plenty.
So let's start by talking about Black Lives Matter movement. For those of you who haven't read their platform, I didn't read the whole platform. I read a synopsis, a summary of the platform with the principles because I'm lazy. But I'll find a link and I'll put it on the RI Future page. So if you listen to this and you want to read it, then you'll be able to find the link. But basically, it's a pretty solid set of principles to not only address the core issue of cops and private citizens murdering black kids with no consequences for no reason nationwide, but also to address a lot of the global problems that have led to that outcome, and their willingness to include the gay and LGBT community in their platform. That was a big thing. I thought that was particularly inspiring because one of the most frustrating things about working on those issues is that there's a whole subset of the gay, lesbian, transgendered community that as soon as they got their cookie, right, as soon as they got their marriage, as soon as they got their legitimacy, they went right back to being conservative. I've known plenty of Republican gay men who were perfectly happy to go back to voting for Republicans and had no interest in talking about racial justice just as soon as their marriages were legitimized. Right. And so I thought it was really, and that's a classic thing that you hear that there's this division between them. So I think it was really inspiring and comforting to see them talk about that as part of their broader struggle. And of course, feminism, an end to the patriarchy as well. another big. There's this word intersectionality. I mean, we'll probably talk about that in later on when I have Megan Coleman on in a week or two. But all of these different struggles and these isolated conflicts, they're really interrelated. They're all part of a system that generates these sorts of divisions, and that system is the core problem. I feel like we're dealing with. So what are your thoughts on that, Mike? I mean, I know we've been talking for a while.
It's definitely one of the most comprehensive political position that any organization has put out probably in the last 50 years. It has solid policy solutions as well as model legislation attached to each solution. So it's and it's inclusive, which is the most important part about it. So like in the social justice section at the Jobs with Justice national level, we've been having a lot of conversations about access to meaningful work, childcare, increasing minimum wages, earned sick leave, control of schedules, more vacation time, like this breadth of things that would affect every American in a very, very positive way, but affects particularly low-wage workers who have over 50% of which are African American, means that's the framework that's being used. Then the definitions that are used to define what is blackness in the United States is a very, very specific and very meaningful thing attached to it, as well as inclusiveness with the other traditionally oppressed groups in the United States. Black Lives Matter is formed by trans and queer African American women at their heart. So the root of the organization is going to be feminist, and it's going to be trans positive, it's going to be queer positive throughout every step of it. And the fact that it's a black organization makes it by definition a working class organization. And it's definitely inside that framework. It is a solid piece, and it's definitely worth visiting. I disagree that parts of it that it's unachievable or in scope. It's massively ambitious, as it should be. But when we were going through, one of the things that we've done, and I've done this with DARE, and I did this with Jobs with Justice and NAACP over the past week or so, or the past 10 days since we first read it, is do an inventory of what our policy wins have been so far, and some of them dovetail already with some of the things that have happened inside the program, the Black Lives Matter program. So Ban the Box, for example, Rhode Island has a very good Ban the Box law. It's not the best Ban the Box law, but it's definitely a huge improvement. And it's one that's moving through, and that's a significant change, as well as the...
And when you say moving through, sorry to interrupt you, but when you say moving through, was it actually passed, or is it...
It was actually passed.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah, it was passed, and it's the model. So like Detroit is passing a model version of it that was authored here. That is that's a life-changing thing for the people who are affected by it. And again, these are people who are ensnared inside the criminal justice system. Not being apologetic about abolition of the prison system is also something that it should be part of the conversation. It was part of the conversation 40 years ago, that abolition of the prisons was a standard part of the conversation. And it's something that we've completely lost in the past 40 years. Like we've regained a more authoritarian view, and this kind of reasserts a more liberatory version of criminal justice, and I think that's really important. It's restoration as part of the goal. And that was the original, for all of the faults and terrors of the American prison system, it was a reform that produced it. It was a reform movement anchored largely in the Quakers to be not as punitive, but going to prison as punishment, not for punishment. And what we've seen is a switch to the threat of sexual violence being part of the core of going to prison, that you go to prison to have a hard time, not to be in prison. It's the removal from society that's the punishment. And so losing sight of that basic understanding of what the role of a prison system is has made it a place to warehouse people who are poor and people who are black and people who are Latino and indigenous populations. So it's a reasserting the restorative process that's possible.
Well, my response to that, of course, will certainly be grim, because that's what we do here. But my response to that is, so let's say, okay, we want to abolish prisons, right? Good, I'm all for it. Now, we have in this country a prison system that is, I don't want to say predominantly private, but to a large extent prisons are run by private for-profit corporations. Certainly they will lobby with all of the considerable corrupt resources at their command for lowered standards in prison, which produce abhorrent conditions. Right, I read a great expose in, I think it was Rolling Stone, where the guy, it was like pages and pages where the guy, he went undercover as a journalist and got a job as a prison guard, and he worked it for I think it was 5 or 6 months, and he just reported on the absolutely surreal conditions that he was confronted with, because it was a private prison, right? And I can tell you as bad as, because I know people that work in public prison systems as prison guards, oddly enough, and as bad as that is, and as horrible as that is, and there are really some things we could talk about about there too. It doesn't hold a candle to the private prison system.
Well, okay, so that's not entirely true though, and I'm not going to defend private prisons because one of the things inside the Black Lives Matter platform is an end to private.
You can't defend the indefensible.
No, you can't. But to draw a line between what the conditions like were in Angola and Louisiana to what private prisons are now, there's a significant difference. Private prisons, the mass graves of Angola are a real thing, and that is a for-profit enterprise run by the state. Mm-hmm. So it's not that it's that you could pick an aspect of the prison system. You could say private prisons are a problem, and they are an issue inside of the prison system, but they are not. They are also a product of the existing system.
Well, I would certainly agree with that. I think that they are a consequence of Americans' insatiable lust to criminalize the black body, the black male body, and also it's like there's a great deal of thought. I'm not gonna. I don't have a specific article because I've read several over the years, but a great deal of thought around the idea that the only reason marijuana is even criminal was because, why it's so punitively punished as a drug was because Hoover wanted an excuse to warehouse the hippies, right? To defang the anti-war movement,
and
right?
Also break down levels of solidarity was the
yes.
I mean,
to destroy solidarity.
Right.
That's a
I mean,
good
I think it was Burke, the British philosopher, who said it's a crime to sleep under a bridge whether you're rich or you're poor.
Yeah.
But the only person that's going to be punished by that is obviously going to be a poor person.
Yes.
So the laws, lifestyle laws, of which pot criminalization was definitely one of them, or opium, anti-opium laws, which targeted specific populations,
right,
were tools of control. I mean, the only argument that, and I don't know very much about the mechanics of how this actually went through, but I mean, when marijuana was outlawed, it was also during the ascendancy of DuPont in making synthetic cord, and 90% of all the rope that was produced by hemp. And so switching to synthetics, especially during the war years, was very, very important for DuPont.
Their bottom line.
And so to make this innocuous plant illegal served a very distinct profit motive, plus served another motive as well.
So I think, but that really, I mean, you're making my case for me, or at least the case I'm about to get to. And by the way, I like that we're recording this, and somewhere else in the building, somebody's playing Rage Against the Machine.
Very funny.
We can hear it. That's I like that.
But inside of your Unitarian Church office is pretty funny.
But basically, you're making my case for me about how this is a non-realistic series of asks, because when we have and the only reason, or the main reason I brought up private prisons, although I did get distracted, and I apologize for that, but the main reason I brought them up is to show here you have a population of capitalists, of shareholders and CEOs, and like to them, depriving them of their ability to profit off of the imprisonment of black people.
No, I got it.
Is something that they will kill to protect.
No, I got what you're
Right.
saying. But the thing is, before the advent of private prisons, they were profiting from the prison system.
Well, that's fair.
You know,
that's
and
fair.
so like when,
But you can't argue that the prison system has massively expanded over the past couple of generations.
no, but the expansion of the prison system actually predates privatization of prisons.
True.
So
That's
I mean,
true.
there was one in 1983. Wackenhut was the only operating private facility in Arizona at the time.
Right, and I think
And that was a complete fluke. I mean, was Spy Magazine, I think, did a huge expose on it, which everyone's like, private prisons is a ridiculous concept. But then the end game goal of the prison system, you have to ask the two like core questions, which is who benefits and who profits.
Right.
So if we're in a racist society, which we are, by removing large numbers of African American men, largely men, although now women are increasing, there is a profit
Full
for
feminism.
right. There's a profit for the majority population to see that happen. It is a maintenance of privilege in order for that to happen.
And that's what I'm getting at, is that like we haven't even touched on privilege yet, but like so here you have this small minority of capitalists who will do any corrupt, horrible thing you can imagine to keep their little niche market, right, which is private prisons. Because if we turn people out of prisons, right, then they're going to say the only way we won't fight that is if you compensate us for the beds that we're not being able to fill because you're not in prison.
No, and you see that in the context that municipalities and states sign with private prison.
Right,
So,
and they don't know, and they don't know what they're doing in a lot of cases, because I think one of the my big objections to the entire political process is that it's all of this nonsense about representative government and all of this bull crap about how we're all going to participate in collective decisions. And how come the end result of that process is always inbred lawyers with new Roman numerals at the end of their name are the only people that ever get to go serve in public office, right? I'm tired of voting for white lawyers from wealthy families. I'm so tired of it. And that's all that's ever on offer. Occasionally a realtor makes it through, another degenerate, scummy profession, right? Because lawyers impose the law on the boots of the population, right? And realtors implement redlining around all of the laws that are designed to prevent it.
It's global in scope, and I do not mean to or pretend to think that the Black Lives Matter platform or the policy solutions are anything but revolutionary.
Yes.
Like there are serious steps inside of that will cause conflict. Cause a direct confrontation between the force of capital and the force of working people.
And at some point, I think one way to look at it is at some point property needs to be unmade, right? Just like after slavery, right? One of the big impetuses behind defending slavery, of course, we could spend podcasts about this, but one of the big impetuses was, black bodies are property, right? They are a natural resource and they belong to the person that pulls them out of the earth. Just like iron ore, right? You go to Africa, you mine some black bodies with murder.
The language is still used. Human resource is still the way people are described.
Right. You are property. And the Civil War not only unmade that property, but explicitly deprived slave owners of their ability to get government compensation for their losses, which was a big deal at the time, right? Because they said, well, if we're going to have the government take away our slaves, we want to be compensated for the loss of property, right? And so what was revolutionary about that is they said, no, this isn't property anymore, right? And in order to unmake human beings as property, I mean, I'm not trying to say that obviously the Civil War didn't end enslavement of African Americans, but it certainly ended the official lawful position of black people being property.
Well,
right?
No, it didn't. It didn't at all. It ended other human beings being property in the civic realm. So as a private citizen to another citizen.
Okay, so you're saying that they're still property of the country.
Right. So
okay, I see
and
what
that
you're
the
saying.
14th Amendment only is the limits of the 14th Amendment end at the courthouse steps.
They do. They absolutely. Those are fair points. Those are fair points.
If you look at particularly in the South, where and how prisons are situated, like Angola, which I mentioned before, was literally just it doesn't even have a fence around 2/3 of it, but it's about half the size of Rhode Island, and it's a former cotton plantation. Cotton that was produced for northern factories. I mean, it wasn't a neutral thing.
Right.
And that all of the people who were enslaved inside Angola we're still picking cotton.
Right, and
that cotton has a zero labor cost.
And that's true, and I think that you, I don't want to say that it's a small point, but I'm talking more about the global. It's very important to note that even at the time, the seeds of the current dilemma had been planted then. Right.
Oh yeah, no, they were planted in Jamestown in 1636.
Absolutely. They were probably planted by Columbus when he first got off the boat, and tortured the natives to find their gold.
Right.
But what I'm saying is, in order to just get that important reform, which is that human beings can't be owned by other human beings, right? Human beings are no longer a natural resource that belongs to whoever pulls it out of the ground, right? But rather they're nominally, in large part, owned by themselves or by the state as an entity, right? Even that reform required a war, right? And in order to save the world, we're going to need to unmake a lot of property.
Yeah,
we're going to need to say that derivatives aren't property. We're going to need to say that fracked gas is no longer property, right?
I get it, and don't mistake me defending any aspect of capital. Like I'm not going to do it. But I am going to say that even if we are kind of approaching what could be considered one of those great upheaval moments that, and which it definitely feels like almost everyone I speak to worldwide, we have this feeling, doesn't mean that it happens. And it also doesn't mean that in the lead up to it, that you don't do what is Noam Chomsky described as increase the size of the cage, right? So if we're trapped inside a really tiny box and we're beating our heads against the bars all the time, then making the box bigger is a meaningful change for the people who are trapped inside the box.
Yes.
And so it means that the effort has to be done to both come up with reasonable and achievable, winnable policy solutions and organizing solutions on the ground in that run-up. But the other thing that I always... all right, so when you look at a war, and taking the Civil War is a great example, you see...
It was a war, yes.
Yeah, it was a war. It was a good war. You see these huge...
I don't know if it was a good war. It was a tragedy that it needed to happen, but it definitely needed to happen.
Is you see huge armies of men fighting against each other, killing each other as quickly as they can, and the narrative that gets told is always from the perspective of the soldier or the general. The perspective of the displaced or the refugee family doesn't get told. Right? And so as a person with my political background, my specific ideology, I don't care about the soldier. Like I don't. I simply don't. Would that person who would be displaced or harmed by that action, the fact that they don't have agency in that choice is the thing I'm more concerned about.
Well, I think there though it's sort of the paradox of revolution, right? Is the majority of the people rarely want revolution. If you poll people, what they usually want is modest reforms so that they can be left alone in peace, right? And but that's never. To be a revolutionary automatically puts you in the minority of people who are absolutely rejecting expanding the cage. But most people, if you poll them, they will settle for, they will accept, they will enthusiastically endorse enlarging the cage.
I think that the examples that can be cited of revolutionary change that have happened don't include those people. That the grandmother trying to figure out how to get food from a burned field isn't part of that conversation.
That's true.
And so I don't know what she thinks, and neither do you, because she hasn't been asked.
Right.
Because women don't have agency, children don't have agency, and we don't include them in those narratives, right? And so because we don't include them, we suspect and we can surmise what they're going through. But the fact ends up being that the choice they may want, and I'm sure they do, want revolutionary change. I'm sure they do want to be able to live in peace and freely among equals. I'm sure that we have a tendency towards fairness.
I see, and that's the part I disagree on. But finish your thought.
Okay. Well, no, I mean, you can see it in a 6-year-old when they try to make rules for games. Is that they try to establish systems of fairness. Human beings we're social animals and we seek fairness. We do. I fully believe that. I think that, but
Well, I have a response to that.
yeah, I'm sure there
Finish
is.
your
I'm
thought.
sure there is. But at the same time, though, like you see pictures from places like Syria, for example, or Syria's a good example, and you see children. That's what I see. I don't see
Right.
soldiers, and I don't care. Soldiers are armed, armored, and defended all the time. They have huge governments that make rationalizations for what they're going to do. Every side believes they're the right side, as long as they're a soldier. Nobody says that grandmother or that kid who lost his school or her school or can't get clean clothes or fresh water or who is dying because they have dysentery, nobody asks that kid. Nobody asks that kid what is healthy or good for that person. And I think that I don't think you can be a revolutionary unless you're including that voice as a central voice. I think we have a European romantic notion of desperate battle. And I think that is one of the things that has led to this destructive place that we're at right now. And I think that we have to free ourselves from that and use a much more humane and much more inclusive vision of humanity, which means that we have to be thinking about 3-year-olds and actually literally taking that 3-year-old's voice into account when we think about, you know what, I'm gonna have a running street battle on the street. I know there's a preschool there, but maybe they won't be in that day. If I ask the 3-year-old, chances are they wouldn't want me to be shooting on their street.
Mm-hmm.
The bit of hot metal that rips through skin rips through children's skin much harder.
And so here's my reply to all of that.
Okay.
So we'll start with the fairness thing, because I want to come back, and then we'll talk about the hot metal. Yes, I think anybody that spent time around children has observed that instinct towards fairness, right? But evil is also inherent. It's also written into your DNA. No. I have home videos of my family as children, and I see 5-year-olds just beating up 3-year-olds because they can, because they need to feel powerful.
I'm not going to say that human beings that infants are probably the best expression of atavism of any animal you're ever going to see.
Yes.
Right? And I'm not going to say that I think there are two ways of looking at human nature. And I think there's two really kind of great ways of looking at human nature. Like we have a really kind of amazing example of human nature turning into one of the most barbaric things we've ever seen, right? We have Europe throughout the last 100 years, where we could just say Europe as a whole has been a barbarous, bloody place, either inflicting death and damage on themselves or winging it around the world as often as they could.
Well, I don't know why we need to just look at Europe. I don't know why we need to just look at the last 100 years.
No, well, I'm going to look
entire
at
human history.
I'm going to look at Europe. Well, the entirety of human history isn't documented.
True.
So I'm not going to look at the
Well, the entirety of the history of the last 100 years of Europe isn't documented because, as just demonstrated, the
last
voices of the
100 years
refugees
of
don't
Europe
get
is fairly well documented.
relatively speaking.
It's pretty well documented. People kept pretty good notes from World War I on. Has been pretty solid, right? Mm-hmm. The history of the slave trade in Europe as a trading exercise is pretty well documented. The history of colonialism in Africa is when it comes to money, Europeans count every penny. They do. And so they document very accurately every step of the way. So through their ledger books the brutality of that culture. There's a cultural brutality. So you could say, if you looked at this one aspect, this little lens right here, and said, I'm going to look at Central Europe for 100 years, you would define Belgium, Germany, France, England, Holland as among the most brutal and brutalist groups of people that have ever lived on the face of the earth.
Yeah, until you looked at all the other ones, we were just as bad.
Well,
by and large, with regional variations,
but again,
with moments of
again, the oldest continuous cultures on Earth in Aborigine society in Australia and Northern society among the Inuit don't have that same history,
and they have a very different version of human nature than what is
Well,
in
that's
Europe. And same with the tribes of New Guinea, where there is warfare which is ritualized but has no eliminationist goal or profit motive attached to it. Where you could look at the federated tribes of North America, where yes, there was warfare, but it was never to the goal of extermination again. And there was always a respect of the actual human being at the end of it. Those histories, or African cultures with the Dogon Republic or the Dinka, who live in total cooperation in equal society, which are the oldest cultures on earth, which are probably a better representation of human nature.
Since better, see that's the thing.
I'm going to go with it.
Is when you say better, like human beings devised European culture,
Yeah,
right?
they did.
You know, and like you can find isolated pockets of communities inside of Europe that were far less violent or aggressive, far more tolerant, more expressive of those positive virtues. Oh, I don't know. I mean, you mentioned earlier, I think, the Quakers in America, how the Quakers had reform. The Quakers are certainly a subculture of Americans who are more peaceful and isolated.
Who profited mightily from the cotton trade.
And they did.
Knowing exactly where the cotton was coming from. So it wasn't like, yeah, they professed a peaceful history, but again, it was predicated on the idea that there was a saved and an unsaved.
Yes.
That there was a goodness and profit, and there was a deserving and undeserving.
Yes, well, that's fair.
That is a European thing.
Okay.
And so I think if you're going to look at an example, I mean, and the only reason I'm saying is like the idea of modern capitalism, modern nation state, prison, modern warfare, eliminationist warfare, genocide, you can pretty much pin it in a singular spot. There are...
Well, yes, I mean,
so given that, though, that means that the decisions about what revolution looks like should not be coming from that area.
So I get what you're saying. I just think that what does a revolution look like if it's nonviolent? I mean, what is the lesson of these ancient cultures? The lesson of history is as soon as some asshole with a gun shows up, your ancient culture is detritus, right? Is they sweep you from the board, right? And they do it because they're eliminationists, right? They want to annihilate you. They want to take your children, and like if they don't kill your children, they want to indoctrinate them into a new society, right? Which we did here in America until like the 70s. You know, it was the official policy of the U.S. government to annihilate the culture of the remaining Indian tribes.
There's no denying that.
So that's what I'm saying is you're saying you have this vision of human nature, you know, of an ideal society, and I definitely get the longing.
I don't.
Okay.
I don't have a vision of an ideal society. I am certainly not qualified to make decisions about that.
Right. I mean, I'm sorry, I misspoke. It wasn't quite what I was getting at.
The other idea of human nature is that human nature, I believe, is fully mutable. And the examples I use are children for that. Is that children are born as atavistic. They are hungry, they scream, they get it, and then they are not hungry. Their needs are central, and they dictate the needs of all the people around them, as they should. Infants need to do that. That doesn't mean that we need to cling to the infancy of ourselves to be the correct version of ourselves.
Well, I agree with that.
In order for us to, like, we can move past lots of things that we would think of as natural and come to a natural state. I think that we have examples, I think we have many examples of that happening, and I think we have ways of looking at it that are more inclusive. But I do think that the model of desperate warfare, the need for bloodshed, for change to happen, I think are way overly romanticized. I think that they are oftentimes part of the problem and not part of the solution. And I think that it's the cart before the horse 9 times out of 10. And it's also a way for somebody to move without having to move. There was a IWW organizer that I was friends with years ago. He's a tugboat captain in Galveston, this guy Arthur Miller, and he wrote, but not plays, who said that violence represented a failure to organize.
No.
Oh,
No.
I think he's absolutely right.
I don't think history backs you up.
I don't
Martin
think
Luther
history
King-
needs. I don't think
Martin
history
Luther-
needs to back me up. Though. I
Martin
don't
Luther
think,
King was organized, and there was violence.
I'm
whenever
not
he did
saying
the
that.
movement.
I'm not
he
saying.
committed
I'm
violence.
also not saying that just because there isn't a precedent doesn't mean it can't be done.
Well, I agree with
So
that.
I think like if somebody's a revolutionary and considers themselves a revolutionary, if they only have to look to antecedents, then they're not actually revolutionary.
I would agree with that. Here's without making a point about antecedents. I think you still haven't really addressed my fundamental concern. I think you make a lot of good points, and I'll have to think about some of this stuff because I'm not prepared with opinions on a lot of these things. You'll need to live with me before I can really feel like I have an opinion on it. But one thing that I feel like you haven't addressed is, and this is something that philosophers and people have thought about for a long time. I've seen 5-year-olds oppress 3-year-olds simply for the pleasure of being able to oppress, right? Nobody taught them.
Ah, really? Were those 5-year-olds raised in a vacuum? Did they?
Why is it that fairness is intrinsic but oppression is not?
Because we do have an instinct towards fairness. Because we're social animals.
I think we have an instinct towards fairness and oppression because plenty of social animals create their societies around both of those things. If you look at animals in nature, if we're going to have that conversation,
Oh, I'm not
there's certainly examples of animals that form egalitarian sharing societies,
Sure.
and there are certainly examples of animals who form tyrannical authoritarian
Right. So, but
societies.
this actually is. You're kind of making.
So you're saying we're
making my
social
point.
we're social
You're
animals.
making my point for me.
Am
to
I?
tell you the truth. Is
Okay.
that if our politics are going to be dictated by what we believe is immutable in us, then we should accept that. So if you believe that well, first off, the example of a 5-year-old is awesome. Because 5-year-olds live in societies of people who raise them and they learn their examples, they learn their behavior. So there's that.
Granted,
so,
but you're-
hold on now.
Okay,
They learn their behavior. So it's not like there's no examples of cruelty for them to witness. And it's not like there's no examples of moments of fairness. It's not like there are no examples of them. The job of a child is to explore their intellect and what's possible. So they are going to go through process where they are going to be brutal, and they are going to go through process where they are generous. But they are learning the process, and they're learning by the examples that they witness every day. It doesn't come up out of whole cloth because simply it would be an unbelievable cruelty and child abuse to put 2 children in a room without any exposure to language or other human beings and then say, okay. So we don't know, honestly, how these children behave. If we go to different cultures, it's very possible we'll see 5-year-olds behaving in a very, very different way. If you take them out of an industrialized society, it's very possible they will behave in yet another way. We don't know.
Well, I think we don't know. We can't know. It's
We
one of
know
those
our
things
examples.
we can't prove conclusively that global warming is real because we can't run trials on
Totally
multiple
different.
Earths.
This is a totally different thing.
I mean,
Is that,
but-
like, there
but
are
what I'm
five-
saying,
so
I'm just
there-
using it as an example
There are
about
5-year-olds that
the
exist.
boundaries of how you can prove something according to the experimental law.
I'm not trying to. I don't have proof, and I'm not going to say that there's proof, and I refuse to say there's proof. But I'm fairly certain, and I've traveled some, that I have seen 5-year-olds behaving in vastly different ways towards each other.
Well,
That I can say with full authority.
I think
And I could,
yes.
and I could also say I have seen human beings treat each other in vastly different ways.
Yes.
But I can say that there's one thing in common throughout all of these things. Soldiers are always armed. Soldiers have far more control of their day-to-day lives than that 5-year-old does. And that even if that 5-year-old treats that 3-year-old badly, I doubt that that 5-year-old would want to blow up or have the capability of doing it.
The
And
3-year-old?
Yeah. Or
Well-
the parents of the 3-year-old. And I
I
think,
think
that
a-
becomes a very, very different thing. That decision that the 5-year-old makes actually becomes pretty valid in that moment. That whether they choose to have their neighbors exterminated or not exterminated is a real question. And I think that to say, like, yes, in the retail level, they can behave like monsters towards each other. But I think if you said, like, yeah, we can eliminate this person, you would never, ever see them again. would be a very, very different question to ask a 5-year-old.
I think if you asked a 5-year-old at the right moment, he'd sign off on
So, but
eliminating his
then
enemies.
it's moment determined.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So if that's
I would
the
say
case,
that- I would say that-
wouldn't it be up for a 5-year-old that lives in North America inside an industrialized country? That is your example.
well, I mean, I don't
You don't have another one, right?
have a lot of
Right,
5-year-olds. I've only spent time around the 5-year-olds, and I've spent time around.
Right, so, but,
and
I mean-
the preponderance of them, yes, have been
Right.
North American.
Okay, so if North,
They come from different backgrounds, but granted, I mean,
they're going to be inside of this.
I don't have time in my life to become an expert on
of course
everything.
not. And so, like part of me is really regretting giving the infant example because it's just such a terrible one at the end of the day. Because you can't.
Well, I think what I'm trying to get out, the reason I mentioned the animals is because you say, well, human beings have this instinct towards fairness because
Tendency.
we're
I didn't
this
say
tendency towards fairness because we're social animals, and societies, in order to create societies, you need organization, is how I interpret that, right? And fairness is one way to organize, right? But tyranny is another.
Well, okay. So here you go. This is actually a much easier way to frame it. You need cooperation for a society to work.
You need cooperation defined as multiple people laboring together towards common goals, but you don't need cooperation in the sense of willingness, right?
Raising a child requires cooperation.
Right, and so does picking cotton, right?
Well,
I need
no,
to
hold
feed.
on now.
I need to feed the
Hold on.
slave so that they'll
Hold on,
pick the cotton.
Hold on. Let's not do that. Let's just stick with a core atomic unit of a society. Let's start with the
Okay.
family.
All right.
On some level, there has to be a basis of cooperation.
I guess what I'm saying is I don't want to necessarily get drawn into a semantic argument, but I feel like the word cooperate is a trap, right? Because if we define cooperation as people working together for the advancement of the whole, then yes, I think there has to be cooperation.
No, cooperation is a way more nuanced.
So provide a definition of cooperation.
So you can, like you said, you can whip somebody into making a society advance.
Right, and then I must feed them in order for them to continue
Or they must be
providing
fed.
labor. They must be fed.
They must be fed.
Right, and so I have to have a society.
Enslaved people fed themselves. So, which
True.
was part of the deal. It wasn't that nothing was given.
Right.
So there had to be cooperation among the organization of slaves
True.
to take care of each other.
Okay.
So, and then the liberatory part of slavery, which every slave makes an attempt at some point, majority did, or at least spoke about it from the slave narratives, required vast organizations of cooperative people
Okay.
that
But the
never had direct contact with each other.
But the Underground Railroad didn't end slavery.
No, but the Underground Railroad.
Even the Civil War
The
didn't
Underground.
end slavery,
The
as
Underground
we've already
Railroad was a
established.
tiny part of the resistance to slavery. It was a tiny part of it. It was part of it, and it's one of the most famous parts of it. But it was just part of it. The numbers of people that ran to La Jolla, Florida, isn't counted in the story of the Underground Railroad, nor the slaves that fled to fight alongside the British in 1812. They're not counted inside that story. Or the slaves that fought with John Horse to make it all the way to Mexico aren't included inside that story, right? So yes, we have one example, but what you get when you build a larger framework for it is a much larger narrative of cooperation and resistance.
So what are you getting at?
I'm getting at is that if you look at structures of resistance and process of resistance, and if you look at what are the things that are compelling to make those things stable and move forward and create structural and long-term change, as human beings, they tend to be centered on the family, and they tend to be centered around the women and children of that family. Stories are passed down parent to child. Food culture is passed down over a cooking pot. Rearing of children requires a huge amount of cooperation on a large scale. And that cooperative instinct, and I am going to go with instinct on this, does come from human nature. Human beings cannot deliver children alone. They can't. Men being incapable of actual delivery mean that other women are dependent on other women in order to do that. That is a cooperative process. The mother of a child needs time to recover, which means she needs to be fed, and that's done largely by the larger culture. There's an interest, a selfish interest, but there's also a narrow interest in maintenance of culture in that. And also maintenance of the better parts of society. It's a moment that's universally celebrated. And so you can look at society as having two parts. Is the universally celebrated part of shared experience and shared struggle with a delivery at the end of it, if you want to use a birth analogy, or the people that seek to kill it. And it's one or the other.
I mean, my instincts tell me, my training tells me that that what you're describing is fundamentally not descriptive. Like you're talking about a real phenomenon, but at the end, you're talking about the family or the absence of the family. Like I'm not really sure what, it's one or the other is what you just said, but I don't understand what your conclusion is. Yes, obviously, in order for there to be more children need to be created, right? And the process of creating children requires many steps, right?
And many people.
And many people, but the process of creating children, without needing to get into details, you can create a child for a purpose in a horrific way, and it has been done, right?
Yeah, you could. But okay.
So
you could. You absolutely.
I'm saying that
you could.
You're saying the family is a foundational unit. I'm saying
No. I'm not trying. Yes, I did say it comes down to like an atomic.
Yeah.
That you have.
Like it's an
A
atomic.
mother and a child.
Right, and an atomic can't be. But I don't like the word atomic because atoms can be split in this instance, right? The family can be.
Well, no.
Nothing. The family isn't immune to the perversions of an evil system.
An infant can't survive without mothering.
Without parenting.
Mothering. It can't survive without mothering.
Okay.
It needs to be fed, which is what a mother can do. I mean,
Right.
we have science that can allow us to do it.
Okay, but
in exclusion of external factors.
But in your definition of mothering, then a man could mother a child.
Absolutely, a man can mother
Right.
a child.
So-
No, of course, that's the truth. But a man obviously cannot deliver a child.
True.
The conclusion here
Yet.
is that the cooperative part, right? The cooperative part of humanity comes down to its atomic part, which is the delivering of children.
Right, and
Which it requires, with human beings, a cooperative effort.
And what I'm saying is, I agree with that, but only in the sense that you distorted the words cooperate and atomic. Like, I feel like the definition of those words, as commonly understood, is not what you're getting at. The family, yes, to rear a child requires nurturing, requires mothering, if you want to put it that way. To deliver a child, at the moment, requires the involvement of a woman, But
You said it like that's a bad thing.
no, I'm. It's not a bad thing. I'm saying it like it's a thing that you're saying that we should imagine a future that does not yet exist. We shouldn't be as revolutionaries tied to our antecedents. And I'm saying we should not expect that our enemies will be tied to antecedents either.
No, I would never expect that. But
In the past, slave owners owned women as a way of getting around this problem. And in the future, there may be iron wounds or other.
I'm not denying the endless innovation and creativity of people who can't stand human beings. I'm not. That the anti-human, the mechanical, the ugly, is something that has a long and deep history, right? That in so much of world history, at least sections of world history, can be reduced to the thought of how can I extract wealth from this human being.
Yes.
And that's what it comes down to. However, that's not the majority of the planet. The majority of the planet are not capitalists. The majority of the planet are not exploiters. The majority of the planet do not participate in that system. The number of actual people who want to or seek to do that is actually very, very small. I'm not seeking to go back to a point of an idealized version of humanity because I don't think there necessarily is or should be. I like the idea of growth and change. I do like that. And I like the idea that what we consider entertaining in free time alters. I like the idea of what we consider fun alters. I like the idea of what we consider human beings alter. I love the mutability of the entire thing. I think is really beautiful. The thing that I don't like, and I absolutely do not approve of in any kind of revolutionary rhetoric, is the fact that the people who are ultimately responsible for our core cooperation, which is birth, rearing, education, feeding, which traditionally roles have been women, tend not to be part of the let's go kill them crowd. And because of that, that makes me think that maybe their voice may have to be the dominant revolutionary voice.
Well, I think I can agree with you on that. I'm just not. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that we agree on the end game, but I would agree with that statement wholeheartedly. I would. So, I've really enjoyed talking about this, but we've used up plenty of time on it, and there were a few more things I wanted to talk about before I got out of here. So, if with your consent, we will table the conversation of revolution and violence for the moment. We'll talk about other iterations of violence that are perhaps not as revolutionary. So the labor movement, right?
Yeah.
So we have people who are involved in labor, right, or people who are sympathetic to the idea of labor, often use this word, the labor movement. But I've begun to wonder, should we even use the word labor movement? Because there isn't one, right? There is no broad agreement between unions perhaps on some core principles. If you say my members should have jobs as a core principle, right? But apart from that, for example, part of the problem with, obviously not a large part of the problem, not even, it's a part of the problem, but it's not the core problem. But part of the problem with police killing people of color in massive numbers is the tremendous force of their union protections that all falls behind to defend the murderous officer, right? And so obviously I would never say that the problem is truly the policeman's union, because that wouldn't be fair. But I think it would be fair to say, in this problem of racism, right, in this global problem, the union has gone over to the enemy, right?
Okay, so policemen's unions as membership, as participants in the broader labor movement itself, of which there is one and there's an extant one, has always been a closely negotiated and not necessarily participant of. So you have the Fraternal Order, you have the IBPOE, who may or may not be members of a local federation. For lots of very, very good reasons, not least of which is their racism and anti-general labor positions, usually. Cops break up strikes. There's been a much deeper conversation about the role of police and police prison guards inside of AFL federations and whether they should have continued membership in them. There has been expulsions of them from organizations. It's I guess looking at, if you just look at the policemen's unions, they do tend to speak with one voice. They defend their membership to the umpteenth degree in really brutal, horrifying ways. Ways that would be way beyond the pale of almost any other organization. And so you have to ask what their actual function is. I would argue that policemen's unions have functioned as a political wing of police forces and not as true unions. I don't think that they have a solid hold inside labor movements. There's been a move to expel them in total from the AFL itself. And so I don't know. I know that there's broad disagreement on what they do, and there tends to be a lot of statements issued about that. So to that, the president of the AFL, Richard Trumka, has spoken very, very openly about his support of Black Lives Matter and his support of immigrant rights, and has declared that all union halls are to be sanctuary spaces for undocumented workers. I mean, it's been unapologetic in continuing its role as participants in a civil rights movement. And so, I mean, I don't think that that can be, unapologetic.
However,
The
we don't have time to pause it. I gotta get out of here.
So I mean that also has to be factored into it. Like in the thousands, in the 10 or 20 or so thousand individual organizations, you're going to have a breadth of political opinions inside of it. But as a national federation, and as most local federations have adopted an actively pro-black position, and they have not been apologetic about it. You'd be hard-pressed to find a place where somebody came out against BLM or its policies inside the labor movement itself.
Well, they came out outside against it, sure, but they're happy to endorse candidates who are hostile to it at the local and even state level,
Right.
And that's what I'm getting at. Is obviously the policemen's union. I pick it because it's a very egregious example, not because it's quite typical. Because of course it's just the most extreme example
No, they're
that I
pretty
can think
extreme.
of.
They're pretty far out.
But there's certainly other unions where their interest in seeing the American labor force unionized is tenuous at best, whereas they're mostly interested in defending the interests of their members, right? And so you could find other examples that are not as egregious as the policemen's
So
union.
the-
People who might not be completely
Right. So
subverted, but
the
but
leadership-
people who you can't rely on in any meaningful sense.
There's this idea that comes from people who are not, who don't. Well, okay. So there's unions are democratic institutions. Membership ultimately does call the shots on what leadership does.
Well, I wouldn't call
So-
them. I would call them Republican in the sense that
Democratic
they elect
as
their
in-
representatives who then inflict their opinions on the body.
Who they have
They
to
don't
answer.
make decisions
hold on now,
collectively.
Hold on now. How often do most unions meet?
I don't
Don't
know.
know. Right. They meet monthly.
Okay.
Right. So the executive board, the executive committee, the president, the vice president, all have to answer to membership at least monthly. Right.
Okay.
And so policy decisions, if your name pops up in a paper or if something should happen that you may be interested in, a member can stand up and say, "Why did you take this position?" And then you have to answer. And if the membership doesn't like your answer consistently, they vote you out of office. It's not a delegate system, it's a representative system, but it is a democratic system. And it's a much tighter version of democracy than civil democracy. It's one that has much clearer process, it's one that is much more accountable, it has way faster process of recall, it has much, much, much more responsive leadership than I think people assume. And so the assumption is that you have labor leaders who go and make these decisions in spite of or against their membership.
I didn't say that, but
But the reality is that they are either being very, very responsive or they have received a directive to do so. It's very rare, especially if most unions have a political directorship that is directly answerable to their members quickly. I mean, it's as somebody who served as a union officer, you get calls daily, hourly, about specific positions that you are expected to take or not take. Mm-hmm. And you go back to membership and you ask them. And then you confront and you debate and you move through it. I mean, it's a good product. It's a perfect.
well, I'm not asking you to toss out the entire system. I'm only trying to point out that, and we could even talk about, how well do the members even know what their own long-term interests are, but then that I think that ends up being a rabbit hole we don't need to go down at this point. I would say that we have this. You and I talked just before we started about this Andrew Tillett Sachs article about how unions have Stockholm syndrome. But if you don't want to use that article, there was another one about I think it was in The Nation or it was in a nationwide paper anyway, and I have it on Facebook. I just don't remember off the top of my head. Where they talked about unions endorsing and giving money to pro-right-to-work candidates. And it's like, if your membership wants you to endorse that person, you should resign, right? Because you shouldn't, because the purpose of that legislation is to destroy all unions everywhere, right?
Right.
So you should fight to the last man
Okay.
to prevent that. But
Again-
they're happy to not only
a
endorse on paper but give money to these
A union
scumbags.
is a democratic organization. So that local made an endorsement, those 5,000, 8,000 members made an endorsement.
I mean, I don't have the examples on tap.
Well, that's the thing. It's
The
like-
article had them.
Right. Is that if you're talking about did the AFL-CIO Federation endorse or have a list of candidates that include right-to-work candidates?
I believe so, but I don't have the article in front of
I
me.
would seriously doubt it.
Anyway-
I would believe, however, that there were locals who would endorse, and I think that there are probably a couple of they may have had a very good reason, but you would have to be engaged in their process to understand the logic of why they did that. And the fact is that I am not inside their process, and neither are you. That I don't know what led them to that decision.
Oh, it's true. I can only see the outcome, and the problem is that it's very hard for me to just take on faith a process that produces. It's like if I walked out of my house and saw a man shoot another man and then stand over him and plug his corpse, right? Well, there are certainly circumstances where one could theorize that I would sympathize with the shooter, right? But as a layperson, the preponderance of evidence is I just witnessed a murder.
All right.
Right. So
Well,
now,
let's back that up then.
but what you're saying is, I just saw a murder, but we should give the murderer the benefit of the doubt.
Well,
We don't know his process.
inside the United States, since we do have to give the benefit of the doubt. Yeah, you would have to say that person was innocent until they're actually proven guilty.
And that's
So yes, you're right about that. So let's unpack that. So if that guy, what did this guy look like?
so.
No,
Let's
this
say-
is important. Like this actually counts.
Let's say that he's a white man in a business suit
So
shooting
all-
another white man in a business
All white men in business suits. Let's just go with it, right?
suit. Okay.
All white men in business suits, which not a great example because this very well could be true, are killers.
I wouldn't say that.
No. So one union, local, makes a bad choice. Does that mean all the locals make bad choices?
No, but I'm not making that argument either.
No. So and I'm not expecting you to take on faith what their decision is. I'm asking you to understand that it's a democratic process, one that you are not involved in. And so you may not know the circumstance that led to that choice, right? Labor has never been a monolith, and it never should be one. There are local conditions that are different for every local. There are conditions of membership that are different for every member
Right.
that you have to be responsive to, and you have to be immediately responsive to. And to not, there are broad points of agreement that are agreed upon in federation, but the federation membership is voluntary. So there's no singular voice, right? And if there's no singular voice, what you have is a plurality of voices, of which there's going to be a breadth. And they may be good.
And they probably won't be.
Well, saying probably won't be is like, okay, so obviously you think labor is most likely just going to make that bad decisions then.
Well, I don't-
that's literally
Here's-
what you just said. You said they probably won't be is a supposition on what the future decisions that labor is going to make. Okay, if you think that, don't participate.
Well, here's
Right?
my response to that is that I want to see union membership expand in America.
Which union? All of them?
I want all employees to be represented by their union, by whatever union. I want public employees to have public unions. I want people to be in tiny little unions in their factory with 20 people. I want them to be in massive unions. I think every American worker deserves the protection of the union.
Absolutely.
Right? And that is the official policy of the AFL-CIO and a lot of these other organizations.
Preamble of every union.
Yes, and they have failed to deliver on that. Now, you can make excuses. You can make excuses.
Are they responsible for the failure? Or is it progressive white liberals who do not support pro-labor candidacies or fight against labor, like pro.
Oh, there's
So, I mean,
certainly
like,
truth in that.
You know, the idea that again, are we looking for a perfect solution inside labor? Is that what you want to see?
I want to see nationwide labor
that's not
membership
the
go
question
up.
I asked, because what does that mean? Like, what if the membership was, what if we got back to the 40, 50, 36% rate of membership, which is
Okay.
effective full membership at the end of
Right.
the day? What if we got back to that point?
Okay.
What did the unions look like in that moment?
They were a diverse crowd, but I think there were plenty of racist unions.
No, there was a lot of segregated
There was a lot of segregated
Yeah,
unions.
absolutely.
The unions didn't come around until to be pro-immigrants
Some
as a body.
unions
Didn't
some
come around to be
some
pro-immigrant for a
Needle
long time.
trades were always pro-immigrant union.
Right, but I mean,
Unite Here is a big union.
yeah, it's true.
Yeah, pro-woman. AFSCME has always been pro-woman.
Right, but you can't deny that there were times
No,
when
I'm not saying I'm helping you make your case here.
Okay.
I'm going to work on. I'm working with you to come up with what does it look like to have full membership.
Because I want to get to full
organize-
membership, and you're right, and I will go after those people too. If you didn't, which is, I mean, this isn't about my ego, because my ego doesn't matter. I don't matter. But like in my last podcast, right, there is a gentleman named Jamie Rhodes, and I just laid into him. I expressed my total contempt for him. Now, Jamie Rhodes has only ever been nice to me, but he gets to be in charge of an organization, and then he just only endorses incumbents. He refuses to endorse people that are on board with the issue that his organization is supposedly for, and he'll endorse an incumbent who is vociferously against the issue that his organization is for, solely to fuel his own political ambitions, and then he'll leave. So yes, I have seen the dark pit of awful
but
that
that's
lies at the core of progressive white liberals.
Yeah, but that's-
so
okay,
I'm not going to
so-
say that progressive white liberals are the savior.
No. But to lay the corpse of labor at labor's feet as the sole responsible party is
Well, I didn't say that they were the sole responsible party.
And to say that any response is going to be excuses, and also that probably making bad decisions discounts what the future holds. So, given that framework, which is where you're at right now, this is the position you've made. Where am I supposed to go, right? How do you organize a worker if the supposition is that unions are only going to make bad decisions that are not in their interest in the future?
Well,
Or since it's a worker that we're talking about in a workplace, give them the credit of your own intellect and say you're going to elect the strongest contract that you can in your workplace, and you're going to direct your leadership to follow the needs of that industry and your family.
and my response.
Or are you going to say, this is not going to be a democratic organization that's going to follow my version of progressive values, and if we do not follow them, then you are probably going to make bad decisions?
Well, I think you're building an awful big architecture out of me saying probably not.
I am, absolutely.
You are.
Of course.
And you didn't really allow me to expand on that at all. So allow me to expand on that.
Please.
When I say probably not, I don't think most Americans are making good decisions right now. And I think it's because of this culture of fear. It's this culture of scarcity and fear. So when I say probably not, I'm not singling out unions as being uniquely worse at decision making than anybody else or any other collective body. I just think that so many Americans of various political stripe, I mean, hence the rise of the Orange Gremlin, right? So many Americans of all political stripes, they're saying everything is scarce, there's not enough food to go around, the end is coming, I gotta get mine, I gotta protect my little piece, right? Because I'm afraid, right? And how do you think that the Republicans are so successful? It's because that mentality has been inculcated into the population as a whole for my entire lifetime, certainly. Endless war has become the new peace.
That's all we had.
Right?
Well, we don't know any different.
We don't know any different, right? And I'd agree with that. So when I say probably not, what I'm saying is that there's this mentality of scarcity and of fear. And the fear may be legitimate, right? The fear that a rich white lawyer with Roman numerals at the end of his name will be so petty as to trash your union because you didn't give him an endorsement because over one of your members when he betrayed you on legislation. That is a legitimate fear because these people are scum, right? In the State House. I know you can't validate that, but I'm saying it, right?
When Maura Walsh gets there, you're gonna think she's scum.
Maura Walsh isn't a rich white lawyer with Roman numerals at the end of her name.
No, I get where you're going. With that.
So is it wrong? Do I feel comfortable sitting in judgment of a union that makes a decision to endorse a candidate like that based on the legitimate fear of retaliation against their members and their interests? No, I would never say that they're morally wrong. All I'm saying is there's this tidal wave of anti-labor forces that are coming for all American workers. And if we don't find a way to stop thinking in terms of fear and scarcity and narrow interests, then we're all going to get drowned, right, by the tidal wave.
So, union members are organized based on optimism.
Well, that's true. And that is a problem that I struggle with because I don't have any optimism to give people.
So you can't, employers and bosses sell fear.
Yes.
And that's the common narrative.
Yes.
And so if we have this endlessly pessimistic narrative, then no, collective bargaining agreements are not meaningful.
But-
because you can't say that the person opposite the table is going to negotiate in good faith.
Of those calls that you've received as a union member, how many of them come from a place of fear and scarcity?
Some come from need.
We've talked about, well, I think need...
No, I'm
Right.
not denying that. People need work, and I'm not saying that that fear isn't. It's not immobilizing fear. They know that they can go to their union and hopefully get a solution.
Right.
So that means that it's not like the fear may be founded, but it's fear with power attached to it. So they can act on their need and come out of a place of fear.
Well,
And that allows room for a member to find room to grow, to also to organize. And that if unions start to adopt a position of adopt a similar narrative, it's harder to sell. Right? It's harder to sell optimism, and it always has been. And we're not at our darkest point. I mean, union membership in Rhode Island has increased. There are several places where the narrative has changed pretty drastically, and the strength of our contracts is stronger. So I don't know. I do know that we have a couple of different places we have to get to win.
All right, so that is the toll of our thing. I think that you said a really good thing, which is fear with power attached, which is something that I wanted to comment on because fear with power attached is the end of everything, right? Ultimately, the end game of fear with power attached is
right. So don't misinterpret that. Is that
Right.
the fear? There is fear, and then there is the power to mitigate the fear. That's what I meant.
all right.
Is that calling a union representative because you're afraid of something? Is you're doing it because you do not want to be afraid anymore.
Well, I think that's all the time we have. So there's more I can say about this, but I think that this podcast, as taken as a whole, is appropriately grim, so I can let it stand.
Pretty cool.
Thank you so much, Mike. I really always appreciate it. It's always a pleasure. And thank you to my apparently double digits listeners for listening in. We'll see you next week.